There are many explorers during this age of discovery, but there's a handful from the 15th century that we should definitely be aware of. One of those was Prince Henry of Portugal, who later historians would call Henry the Navigator. Henry was one of the younger sons of the king, which meant he was never going to ascend the throne. So instead, he focused his efforts on developing Spain's navigational, sailing, and colonial policies. He had joined his father on conquests of some cities in North Africa, and he thought the future of Portugal was in exploration and controlling trade. So he explored the currents and trade winds and mapped these out off of the West African coast and the Atlantic, in hopes that his information would be useful to later Portuguese sailors. He also helped develop the caravel and secured a lot of the maps and policies that Portugal would use to expand its overseas empire. One of the sailors who would use Henry of Portugal's maps and knowledge was Bartolomeu Dias. Dias left Lisbon in 1487, trying to reach around the southern tip of Africa, which he did. This is challenging because when you get into the Gulf of Guinea, there's a lot of strong upward currents that push you north. So using Henry's techniques, Diaz was able to reach this point where it gets easier to sail, which is called the Cape of Good Hope. And later, another Portuguese sailor, Vasco da Gama, would use some of the information Diaz had gathered, as well as Henry's techniques, to sail all the way from Portugal to India, which, remember, was the main goal of a lot of these explorers, finding a direct trade route to India. And he secured it for Portugal. Da Gama was also somewhat of a pirate. He was a conqueror, and when the princes in Goa refused to deal with him and agree to Portuguese terms, he kidnapped their princes and attacked their cities and used the ships he brought for warfare. So he did help Portugal secure some of its empire in India, which will be important later. But he didn't do so in the maybe the most nice fashion. Probably the most famous 15th century explorer was Christopher Columbus. And he's got a complicated legacy, which we'll explore more next unit. But for now, I kind of want to clear up some of the myths and misconceptions about Columbus. For one, even though he sailed for Spain, he wasn't Spanish. He was actually from the city of Genoa in Italy. Not a whole lot is known about his early life. But he had developed in his study of maps and sailing strategies from a lot of different sources, from Arab sources, from ancient Greece, and from contemporary European sources. He had sort of this idea about how the globe was shaped. He used this map by the Italian cartographer Toscanelli, which basically puts, here's Spain and Portugal. It put Asia a lot closer to Europe across the Atlantic than is in actuality. Basically, he miscalculated the circumference of the Earth using a couple different techniques. This map sort of has an outline of reality. But his goal, and the goal of other sailors, was to reach Asia, where it says Cathay, that's China, Sapangu here is Japan. And so he had his plan, basically, to sail across the Atlantic to get to Asia and secure those trade routes. And he didn't do this just for sport. He went to King John of Portugal, presented this plan, and asked for not only the money to take the ships and crew, but also to get 10% of any of the profits from lands secured by this exploration, and to be given this title, Grand Admiral of the Seas. And the Portuguese King John declined Columbus's offer, so Columbus went to his rival, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella in Spain. And since they were in competition with Portugal, they accepted his proposal. So in 1492, Columbus left Spain and eventually arrived in Santo Domingo, which is today Haiti. being the first modern European to reach the Americas after the Vikings had very briefly in the 9th century. At first, he thought he was in India, based on his maps, and he returned home and told the king and queen as such. He made 3 more voyages and pretty quickly figured out that that was not, in fact, India. He was briefly appointed the governor of some of these islands out here, although he eventually was forced out of that position. He was not he has a complicated legacy. He wasn't some guy who accidentally stumbled upon a continent. It's actually pretty hard to sail across the Atlantic. He just had some bad maps to argue about where he actually was. And he did not prove the world was round. Everyone already knew it was round going back to the 3rd century. But he is important in sort of opening the door to European colonization of the Americas. And as we deal with colonization in the next unit, we'll see that's a pretty messy legacy as it is. Not only due to Columbus, but to a lot of other conquerors. But he was a skilled navigator with a plan to hopefully get as much money as he could out of this voyage. And he accidentally, almost, sort of started the colonization of these continents, which we'll talk more about next. One other navigator to know from the early 16th century was Ferdinand Magellan. Magellan, unlike the others, was a Spaniard, and he had wanted to sail all the way around the globe, which his crew did. They sailed through the strait, which bears his name, in South America, eventually ended in the Philippines. Magellan got himself killed there because he tried to kidnap some Filipino people, and they, of course, didn't like that. But his crew did eventually manage to sail all the way around the world. So he's the first to circumnavigate or sail around the globe. There were other sailors and explorers that we'll talk more about next unit, but these were probably the most important in the early part of exploration.